Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah here. We're holding Mishnah Berurah and Hashem today. We will be learning Daf Reish Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph. We are continuing to learn the halachas of Iruvei Chatzeros. We pick up today 2 lines off the bottom in the Shulchan Aruch on Reish Lamed Vav Amud Beis in the middle of Siman Shin Ayin Sif Hey. I'm sorry, my apologies. Siman Shin Ayin Sif Hey. Today's share again is going to be an audio-only share. Our learning today should be a schus for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael, Hanasunim Bat Zara Ubat Shivya, Ha'imdim Bein Bayom Ubein Bayabasha, Hamakim Mirachem Aleihem V'Yetziam Yitzara L'Rvacha, Me'afela La'iro V'Yeshiva L'Geula Hashta B'Galo V'Zman Kariv V'Nemar Amen. Our learning should be a schus for Fu Shalema for Achi Agadol B'Shabeh V'Nester Fradel, Yitzchak Ben Tzion Ben Dusha, Rivka Bashir Aleah, Chavadasa Bas Rezel Serel, and Yeshua Levi Ben Ahuva Malkachana. They should all have a refuah shalema b'seich shar chayla Yisrael. Before I begin the shir today, again, I'm running a few days ahead, so when I reference current events, when you listen to this, you may be listening to something that's several days old. I know that there's been a lot going on in the news regarding the situation in the Middle East and the situation in Eretz Yisrael. I just want to remind everyone, if you listen to the news, and I'm not saying that you should, if you're listening to the news, if you're reading up on the news, don't allow yourself to get disturbed by what you hear, by what people are doing, by what policymakers are deciding and what they're saying, etc., etc. Keep your focus on the Ribbono Shel Olam. The Ribbono Shel Olam is the one who's pulling everybody's strings. The Ribbono Shel Olam is the one that's deciding what should happen, how it should happen, when it should happen. What is incumbent upon us is to be mispalel, to daven. What's incumbent upon us is to increase our shmiras hamitzvahs. What's incumbent upon us is to increase our limud HaTorah. What's incumbent upon us is to do tshuva for the things that we need to do tshuva for. That's what's incumbent upon us. Another thing that's incumbent upon us, I believe very much nowadays, is to work very hard to increase your ahavas Yisrael. We have to have, let's remember that one of the main causes of the Churban and the Galus was sinas chinam. Rabbi Say, there's much too much sinas chinam going on nowadays. Klal Yisrael, unfortunately, finds themselves divided into this camp and that camp and the other camp. Rabbi Say, there are no camps. We are all Klal Yisrael. Every single one of us is a member of Klal Yisrael. We should not be divided into camps. You have to have a tremendous amount of ahavas Yisrael. The way to reverse the problems of sinas chinam is by having ahavas chinam. You see another Yid, you have to shower them with love. And it's true, there are Yidden that don't do the right thing. There are Yidden that don't comport themselves in the right way. But that's no reason to be acting in a way that is contrary to ahavas chinam. We have to have a tremendous amount of ahavas Yisrael. That's something that we have to work on very, very hard. Okay, now let's get back to our regularly scheduled broadcast. Reish Lamed Vav Amud Beis, Siman Shin Ayin Sif Hey. We are 2 lines off the bottom in the middle of the line. V'im noisin lehem pras. So just to give a little bit of a recap of the first halacha that we learned here in Sif Hey. What the Mechaber told us in Sif Hey is a rule that governs when somebody is considered to be one of the diurin of a chotzer, and when he's not considered to be one of the diurin of the chotzer. Of course, that makes a major nafkamina lahalacha. If somebody is considered to be one of the diurin in the chotzer, then if he doesn't contribute to the Iruvei Chatzeros, he's going to aser on everybody else in the chotzer. Because even if they join in Iruvei Chatzeros, if he does not contribute, and he's one of the diurin in the chotzer, now there's multiple entities in the chotzer, and now you're not going to be allowed to be metaltal from the bottom of the chotzer to the chotzer, from the chotzer to the bottom, from one bias to another bias, etc., etc. However, if for some reason somebody, even though he's located in the chotzer, is not considered one of the diurin of the chotzer, then there's no need for him to become part of the Iruvei Chatzeros. And on that note, the Mechaber told us in Sif Hey, what happens if you have somebody who has 2, I'm going to call it 2 homes. There's a home that he's using in one chotzer, and he uses that home for his achila. That's where he eats. Then he has a home in another chotzer. The home in the other chutzner is where he sleeps. And nowadays, I think what most people would call that is, they would say he lives in one chutzner, that's where he goes home at night to sleep, and he eats in another chutzner. Yet halachically, that's not the way it works. Halachically, we go after where he eats. Now, in the context of the halachas of Eruv Chatzeros, this really makes perfect sense, right? Because the whole underpinning of Eruv Chatzeros is that wherever you put your pas, that's where you're considered to be living, right? You have your chutzner with 21 units. We all contribute to a pas. We put that pas in unit number 12. We all live in unit number 12. So really, the whole underpinning of Eruv Chatzeros is that the makom depita garam. It's the place where the pas is, the place where you eat, the place where your food is. That's what rules. That's what determines where you live. So now, if we have somebody who eats his meals in a home in Chutzner A, and he goes home to sleep in a home in Chutzner B, well, Makom Depita Garam, we're going to say that he lives in Chutzner A, because that's where he sleeps. Based on that, the Mechaber told us, what do you do if you have a family, and the father has one home, the father has a home in Chutzner A, but then his sons, they live in a different chutzner. Maybe they live in 5 different homes in chutzner B, but they don't eat in their homes in chutzner B. They eat by their father in chutzner A. Well, in that case, these 5 sons are considered to be living in chutzner A, because that's where they eat. They're not considered to be living in chutzner B, where they sleep. How does that manifest itself in halacha? Very simple. They're not going to aser even on the not on the other residents of Chutzner A, not on the other residents of Chutzner B. They're not going to aser on the residents of Chutzner A, because in Chutzner A they're considered to be part of the father's household. So they're not independent of the father. As long as the father contributes to the Eruv in Chutzner A, that's going to cover the 5 sons. They don't have to make an independent contribution to the Eruv Chatzeros of Chutzner A, so they don't aser on the other residents of Chutzner A. They also don't aser on the other residents of Chutzner B, because even though they go home at night and they sleep in their homes in Chutzner B, they're not considered to be diurin in Chutzner B. So they don't aser on Chutzner A, nor do they aser on Chutzner B. That's the halakha that we learned yesterday at the beginning of Sif Hey. Now the Mechaber tweaks the case a little bit and goes further. Says the Mechaber 2 lines off the bottom, a little bit past the middle of the line. V'im noised lehem pras v'oichlim b'bateim. Let's say what happens is like this. The 5 sons, who all have homes in Chutzner B, they don't eat by their father in Chutzner A, but they get their income from the father in Chutzner A. So the father sends them food. But where do they eat the food? They eat the food in Chutzner B. Or maybe the father gives them a monetary stipend. Maybe the father gives them a monthly check, and that's how they get all their food. But where do they eat? They eat in Chutzner B. Says the Mechaber, if the father gives them their support, pras probably literally, in English, you'd probably translate it as a stipend. If the father is giving the 5 sons their support, but they're not eating by their father, they're eating in their homes in Chutzner B, well, in that case, oisrim, then they are going to aser on the people in Chutzner B, because now they are considered to be bona fide diurin in Chutzner B. What's the chiddush over here? The chiddush over here is, you might have thought that since they're being supported by the father, even though they're not eating by the father, maybe they still go after the father. Says the Mechaber, no, I don't care that financially they're being supported by the father. I don't even care that the father is giving them their actual food. If they're not eating in his house, if they're eating in their home in Chutzner B, then they are residents of Chutzner B, and they're going to aser on the other residents of Chutzner B. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Cut Mem Daled. Pras. If the father gives the sons their support, Pirish, Shehem Bekablam Hoitzah Mi Beis Avihen. They're receiving a stipend from their father's household. Ve'ein Chilik Bein Kishe Bekablam Lechem Oy Mois. It makes no difference if they're receiving a financial stipend or they're actually receiving their food. since they're not eating by the father, they're eating in their homes, they are considered residents of the chutzner that they are eating in. And therefore, oisrim al acherim, they will aser on the other residents of Chotzer B, where they're sleeping and where they're eating their food that they get from their father. Now, this took a little while to figure out what the Mishnah Berurah is saying over here with this phrase. These 5 sons will also aser on each other if there's no iruve katzeros in their chotzer. What does that mean? I'll tell you what it means. Let's say the 5 sons have 5 homes in Chotzer B. And besides the 5 homes that belong to the 5 sons in Chotzer B, there are another 5 homes in Chotzer B that belong to other people. So Chotzer B definitely needs an Eruv Chatzeros, right? Now, we're saying that the 5 sons are independent of the father. Even though they receive a pras from the father, since they eat in their own homes in Chotzer B, they're independent of the father. Mishnah Berurah is reminding us, not only are they independent of the father, they're also independent of each other. How does that halachically manifest itself? Well, let's say Chotzer B does not make it a Eruv Chatzeros. You might have had a havamina that if Chotzer B does not make it a Eruv Chatzeros, so fine. None of the homes in Chotzer B are allowed to transfer between themselves to go from one house to another. They can't transfer from the house to the Chotzer, right? But maybe the 5 brothers, since they're all eating the pras that they receive from their father, maybe they're not considered one unit with the father in Chotzer A, but maybe they are considered to be one unit in Chotzer B. Maybe all 5 brothers, right? Reuven lives in house number 1, Shimon lives in house number 2, Levi lives in house number 3, etc., etc. The food that they eat all comes from their father. So there's a unifying factor over here, right? They're all eating the food that they receive from their father. Maybe that serves to unify them in their chutzner. And now maybe we look at Chotzer B, and maybe we'll say that the 5 brothers are one unit, and the other 5 homes are a different unit. And if they don't make it a Eruv Chatzeros in that chutzner, maybe the 5 brothers are allowed to transfer between their homes, because maybe they're one unit. Kamash Malan, the Mishnah Berurah, that no, you don't say that. They aser on the other Bnei HaChotzer in Chotzer B, because they're considered residents of Chotzer B. They also aser on each other, even though they have this unifying factor that they all eat the pras that they get from the father. Says the Mishnah Berurah in Memhei, even if the father and the 5 sons all live in one chutzner, they all live in Chotzer A. But again, the 5 sons eat the pras that they receive from their father in their own independent homes. Since they don't eat on the father's table in the father's home, they're considered to be independent diurin. Okay. Now, the Mechaber tweaks this a little bit. The Mechaber gives a caveat. So remember, what the Mechaber is telling us over here is, if they got a pras from the father, but they don't actually eat in the father's home, they are considered independent of the father. They're also considered independent of each other. Says the Mechaber, V'hani mili kishenoiste b'neish. You know what? Let me give a little akdama here before we say the V'hani mili. What we have to realize is that this case, where the children are receiving a pras from the father, halakhically, we kind of look at this case as a gray area. What do I mean? Well, on the one hand, the fact that they're receiving a pras from the father, and that's the food that they eat, really, that could be looked upon as something that ties them to the father's home, and ties them together as one unit. On the other hand, since they don't actually eat in the father's home, we have very strong reason to look at them as being independent from the father and independent from each other, which is what we've said so far. But it still is halachically a gray area. And since it's halachically a gray area, we treat it as such. And it's going to have a caveat. Says the Mechaber, V'hani mili kishenoiste b'nei shara chotzer eruvan b'makom acher. When are we going to consider the 5 sons to be independent of the father and to be independent of themselves, that's when the other Bnei HaChotzer are putting the Yeruvah Chatzeros in one of the other homes in the Chotzer. So again, you have the 5 sons are in houses 1 through 5. You have a different 5 residents in houses 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Maybe the father is in house number 11. If they're putting the Chotzer in house number 6, one of the houses that belongs not to one of these family members, it belongs to somebody else, then we consider the 5 sons to be completely independent diurin of the Chotzer. But let's say the Yeruvah Chatzeros is being put in the home of one of the 5 sons. In that case, or let's say the 5 sons live in their own little chotzer. There are no other Bnei HaChotzer. It's only the 5 sons. In that case, says the Mechaber, Einam Tzrichim La'arev. So you see, on the one hand, we are going to use the unifying factor that they receive a pras from the father and they eat the pras from the father. We're going to use that to a certain extent. So, for example, if the 5 sons live in Chotzer B and there's nobody else living in Chotzer B, we're not going to require the 5 sons to make it a Yeruvah Chatzeros. We're not going to say that they aser on each other. Why? Because they do have a unifying factor. They all eat a pras that they get from their father. Then we'll look at them as one unit. We won't require them to make it a Yeruvah Chatzeros. Also, let's say the 5 sons live in one chotzer, and there are 5 other families that live in that chotzer, and they're making it a Yeruvah Chatzeros, but they're putting the eruv in the home of one of the 5 sons. In that case, we're going to look at all of the 5 sons as being one bias, and then they're not going to have to make a contribution to the eruv, because we're going to look at them as being the bias that the eruv is being put in, and the bias that the eruv is put in never has to give a contribution to the eruv. So to that extent, we will use the unifying factor of the pras to make them one bias. But if the 5 sons live in a chotzer together with 5 other independent homes, and they're making it a Yeruvah Chatzeros, and the Yeruvah Chatzeros is going into one of the other homes, well, in that case, once there's already an established need for an Yeruvah Chatzeros, and there's an established need for somebody from the 5 brothers to make a contribution, either a joint contribution or independent contributions, in that case, we're going to view them as being a disparate, independent entities, and they're each going to have to make their own contribution to the eruv. And this is a distinction that we've already seen before. This question of where is the eruv being placed, right? Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Kat Memvav. The Hanimili, Pirush. What the Mechaber means to say is as follows. When do we say that we do not look at the fact that the 5 sons are eating a pras from their father? When do we say that we do not view that as an effective unifying factor? That's when that's when there are other families living in this chotzer. So this chotzer already needs a Yeruvah Chatzeros. And they're putting the Yeruvah Chatzeros in one of the other homes in the chotzer. Because then we say, the same way this chotzer definitely needs a Yeruvah Chatzeros, because there are 5 other homes in this chotzer that have nothing to do with each other, and they certainly aser on each other. So this chotzer definitely needs a Yeruvah Chatzeros in hunami asri hadodi. Once we're establishing that this chotzer needs a Yeruvah Chatzeros, and we're looking at the groups that live in this chotzer as being separate entities, right? The 5 homes that have nothing to do with each other are definitely 5 separate entities, right? So then we look at the 5 brothers as also being separate entities, and they all have to make individual contributions to the Yeruvah Chatzeros. But if the 5 brothers are the only ones who live in the chotzer, So there are no other separate entities in the Chatzar. Heim ba'atzman ein maskikin la'eruv. They do not have to make an eruv chatzeros if they're the only ones who live there, because then we will give value to the unifying factor that they're all eating a pras that they receive from the father. Says the Mishnah Berurah in the brackets on Reish Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph. D'hoil shemekablen al kolponim pras me'avien. Because since you do have this unifying factor that they do all eat the pras that they receive from their father, Ha'av mechabran, the fact that they're receiving it from the father, that joins them, umitzarfan, it combines them, liyois ki ish echad, so that we look at them in the context of Reuven Chatzeros as being one group. V'chein, and similarly, if there are other groups living in the Chatzar, but but if the Erev is being placed by one of the five brothers, Arinan, then we say, let's say the five brothers are Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, and Dan, right? And they put the Reuven Chatzeros in Reuven's house. Reuven certainly doesn't have to make a contribution to the Erev because he's mamish the bias shemanichim by ha'erev, right? Gam sha'ar echav nami peturin. The other brothers, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, and Dan, are also potter for making contributions to the Erev, because to that extent, we will look at them all as being one bias, and we'll consider them all to be the bias, Shemanicha bias Erev, umitam hanal. This is true, that we're going to look at all of them as being the bias shemanicha by ha'erev, whether the erev is being put in the house of one of the five brothers, or the erev is being put in the house of the father who lives together with them in the same chutzner. Okay, now we move along to Sivav, and Rabbi Sai, the rest of today's share gets easier. We've accomplished the hard part of today's share. Really, in a funny way, a lot of the rest of today's share is going to be repetitions of halachas that we learned earlier. They're just a little bit different scenarios. Says the Mechaber Tzifav. Let's say somebody has 5 wives. Let's remember, before the Cherem D'Rabbeinu Gershom, it was mutter midaraisa for a man to have more than one wife. Indeed, in Sephardi communities where they don't have the Cherem D'Rabbeinu Gershom, really they don't even have a Cherem. Interestingly enough, that's why the ksuba by a Sephardi is a different ksuba than the ksuba by an Ashkenazi. The Sephardi ksuba has a line in it where the chassid commits that he's not going to take another wife. There are different lashonos. Some of the ksubas say that the chassid is going to make a commitment that he's not going to marry another wife unless he has reshus from Bezdin. In some ksubas, it says that he has to have reshus from the Bezdin Hagodol Sheba Yerushalayim in the Lishkas Hagozis. But this is all because they don't have the Cherem D'Rabbeinu Gershom. That was an Ashkenazi Cherem, not a Sephardi Cherem. But that's why the Mechaber is addressing a case here if somebody has more than one wife. If somebody has 5 wives, or the Chamisha Avodim, or he has 5 servants. Now these Avodim don't have to be Avodim Kenanim. They don't have to be an Eved Ivri. These could even be Misharsim. These could even be laborers, employees that work for him. But the point over here is, says the Mechaber Vayter, Mikable Mimenu Pras. These 5 wives, or the 5 workers, the 5 employees, they eat off of the Balabayas' table. The Balabayas gives them their support. V'chol echad oichel beveisoi. So let's say Reuven lives in a chutzner. Reuven has 5 wives, and he's a rich fellow. So he bought 5 houses for his 5 wives in the chutzner. He has 1 house in the chutzner, and then his 5 wives all have 5 independent houses. But he gives them their support. He either supports them financially, or he actually sends them their food. So let's say they're all eating in their own house, or they're 5 employees, and they each have their own home, but they're all eating the food that the employer sends them, or they're eating off of the money that he sends them. V'chein, similarly, another case, Talmud, you have a yeshiva bacher, or a kol younger man, hamekabel pras merabbi, who receives his support from the Rosh Yeshiva, v'oichel b'veisai, and again, he eats in his house. Einam oisrim zeh al zeh, they don't aser on each other, im eini mahim diyurin b'chatzer, ayim ha'erev ba'etzlam. Again, gray area, the same gray area that we learned about in the previous if. We have again here a case where somebody is not eating his own food. He's not eating in the home of the person who's supporting him. He's eating in his own home, but he's eating off of the pras that he receives or she receives. Either it's wives eating the pras that they receive from their husband, or it's employees that are eating the pras that they receive from their employer, or it's a kol yungaman who's eating off of the pras that he receives from his Rosh Yeshiva. But again, it's this halachic gray area. Do we give value to that unifying factor? Do we say that since they're receiving a pras from somebody, they're tied to the one that they're getting the pras from, and they're one unit with that one? Or do we say no, they're considered independent? Says the Mechaber, it's the same rule as we had in the previous if. It's going to depend. If there are no other diurin in the chotzer, so let's say you have Ruvain is in house number 1, and his 5 wives are in house number 2 through 6. So, okay, if there's nobody else in the chotzer, right, so there are no other separate entities, then we're going to give value to the unifying factor of the pras, and we're going to say there's no need for an eruv chatzeros. Or another case, you have Reuven living in house number 1, you have Reuven's 5 wives in houses 2 through 6, then you have other people living in houses 7 through 12. Well, in that case, it's going to depend on where they put the Erev. If they put the Erev in one of the units from 7 to 12, well, then the 5 wives are going to have to make 5 independent contributions to the Erev. Why? Well, once there's an established need for an Eruv Chatzeros, once we're establishing that we're looking at the people living in this Chatzer as separate entities, we're going to devalue. We're not going to pay attention to the fact that there's a unifying factor of a pras, and we're going to look at Reuven and his 5 wives as being independent. But if they put the Erev by Reuven or by one of his 5 wives, we're going to look at all of them as being the Bayish Aminicha Bayis Erev, and then they will all be exempt from making contributions to the Erev. So again, this sif really is a repetition of the previous sif. Says the Mishnah Berurah Cotton Vav, Chamisha Nashim, Dehem Nami Nimshach Makabalein, Va'adainayan, the 5 wives who receive a pras from their husband, or the 5 laborers who receive a pras from their employer, that is something, Dehem Nami Nimshachin. It's something that can serve as a unifying factor. Oiskam Memtes, the Mechaber used the term avodim. Says the Mishnah Berurah, it doesn't have to be avodim in the classical sense. V'huadin misharsim. It could be laborers or employees. If there are no other diurim in the chotzer, is nun u'kamay ein tzalachin b'sifhei. This is really the same halacha as we had in Sifhei by the 5 brothers. V'dafka, but there is a point over here. There's of course a reason why the Mechaber gave us sivav, and the Mishnah Berurah points out that reason now. V'dafka b'chol elu moil pras, because the Mechaber is telling us that this whole concept of a pras serving as a unifying factor is only when the people who are receiving the pras have an organic connection with the one who's giving out the pras. In these cases, there's an organic reason why they should be tied to the one who's doling out the pras. They're wives and a husband. They're avodim and an adain. They're employees and an employer. They're a Talmud and a Rosh Yeshiva. But if Reuven and Shimon have absolutely nothing to do with each other, but for some reason Reuven decided that he's going to support Shimon, there's no organic connection between Reuven and Shimon. In that case, then we're not going to value the pras. So the pras in a vacuum cannot serve as a unifying factor. The pras could serve as a unifying factor if there's an organic connection between the parties. Moving along to Sif Zayin, says the Mechaber. And this again is going to be really a repeat of something that we learned earlier. This is going to bring us back to Sif Gimel, when we spoke about the 5 chaburis that live in a traklin. Says the Mechaber, and you're going to recognize this halacha right away, at least I hope you will. Says the Mechaber, Asara batim zelif mizeh. You have 10 apartments, but the 10 apartments are set up railroad style. One is behind the other. And therefore, v'kulam oivrim mizeh lazeh, they all have to walk through each other. V'yotzim derech hachitza and l'chatzer. So again, you have some kind of an apartment building. There's a front door to the apartment building. When you open up the front door, you walk into apartment number 1. In order to get to apartment number 2, you have to walk through apartment number 1. In order to get to apartment number 3, you've got to walk through apartment number 1 and number 2. And so on and so forth, just like the 5 living spaces in the Trachlin. What's the halach in such a case? We already know what the halach is. Says the Makar Shnayim Apnimiyim Levad, it's only the inside 2. In this case, where we're talking about 10 apartments, it's apartment number 10 and apartment number 9, they tzrichim litei ba'erev. They're considered to be distinct diurin in the chotzer. They have to contribute to the chotzer's eruve chatzeros. V'ashar pturim, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 are potter. Why they're potter? We know why. We learned it in Sif Gimel. Shakashuvim kulam kibei shar, because they all have the din of a beit shar, right? Unit number 1 is a walkthrough. Everybody has to walk through unit number 1 to get get to their apartments. Unit number 2 is also a walkthrough. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 all have to walk through unit number 3 to get to their apartments, and so on and so forth. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, they are all a beit shar. They're all walkthroughs. Since they're walkthroughs, they can't be a dira. They're not a dira. They don't have to give to the Rivah Chatzeros. 9 and 10 are not a beit shar. Well, 10 is obviously not a beit shar because there's nobody behind 10. 9 is also not a beit shar, even though you got to go through 9 to get to 10, because it's a beit shar liyochid. And we've established that a beit shar liyochid is not a beit shar. Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah, and then we'll see a very important ice cotton in the Shar Hatzion. Says the Mishnah Berurah, ice cotton nun aleph. Tzrichim litain ba'erev, the innermost 2 units have to make contributions to the erev. Shehem levadam taras bayis aleim, because it's only the innermost 2 units that are considered to be bottom, that are considered to be bona fide diurim. Va'isr letaltal b'chotzer, and they would aser on the other b'nei hachotzer. V'chein letaltal mizel hazeh. Also, they wouldn't be allowed to carry from one to the other. V'chein mehem lebatim shelafneim. Right? You wouldn't be allowed to transfer from 10 to 9 or from 10 to 3. Number 9 is also a beit shar, because you got to walk through it to get to 10. Number 9 is still a bias. It doesn't become a beit shar. Kevin the heavy rock beit shar liyochid, since he's only a beit shar liyochid. Now we're going to look at Sharatzion Eis Katan Chavhei. This is something that I mentioned earlier in Sif Gimel. I told you when we learned Sif Gimel that there was a little bit of a stira between Sif Gimel and Sif Aleph. I explained the answer to the stira based on this Sharatzion. Says the Chavetz Chaim in Sharatzion Eis Katan Chavhei. Va'af agav de kasavdu le'el bereish Siman in Mishnah Berurah Sif Katan Aleph le'inyan chotzer the beit shar de yochid gam kein beklal beit sharu. Even though we learned earlier in the Mishnah Berurah in Sif Katan Aleph, not in Sif Katan Gimel, in Sif Katan Aleph, we learned in the Mishnah Berurah that when it comes to a chotzer, let's say you have a chotzer that only has 1 house in it, and the chotzer has a beit shar, and somebody lives in the beit shar. Do we look at this as a chotzer that has 2 diurin because it's only a beit shar liyochid? No, we don't. So in the case of a chotzer, even if there's only 1 home in the chotzer, we look at the beit shar as having the din of a beit shar. So what's the difference? That's a beit shar liyochid. This is a beit shar liyochid. Over here, the Chavetz Chaim explains the difference. Ha-samdehu beit shar de chotzer deloy avid ledira. You see, the beit shar of a chotzer has 2 strikes against it. One is that the gatehouse of a chotzer, the beit shar of a chotzer, is intrinsically not a dira. That's strike number 1, right? You go into one of these housing complexes and it has a gatehouse at the driveway going in. Nobody looks at that as being a house. So a beit shar is intrinsically not a chotzer. That's strike number 1. Strike number 2 is that it is a beit shar that's serving somebody. There is a house in the chotzer, and the people who live in that house have to traipse through the beit shar. So it has 2 strikes against it. It's inherently not a dira because it's a beit shar, and it also is serving as a beit shar, which means that somebody has to walk through it, and that also takes away from its status of its ability to be viewed as a dira. But aval hacha. But over here, where we're talking about living space number 9 and living space number 10, avid lidira. Over here, unit number 9 doesn't have the intrinsic problem that it's not a dira. Intrinsically, unit number 9 is an apartment. It's a bona fide apartment. So it is made ledira. A beit shar is not made ledira. Unit number 9 is made ledira. Right? So the only strike that it has against it is that there's a yachid. Unit number 10 has to walk through it. In that case, a beis shar of a yochid is not going to be considered a beis shar. Okay, says the Mishnah Berurah weiter. Ois katan nun beis. Shachashuvim kulam. The Mechaber said that units 1 through 8 don't have to make contributions to the Ruva Chatzeres because they're all considered to be Beishar. Shachashuvim kulam, says the Mishnah Berurah, shekol echad mehem hu Beishar l'chol hapnimiyim mimenu. Each unit 1 through 8 is a Beishar for the units that are behind them. Ve'ena chashiv dira, kev cherabim ayvrim alav. They can't be considered a dira because people have to walk through them. Ulefiza, according to this, the Mishnah Berurah tells us an interesting halacha, which is a little bit counterintuitive. Ulefiza, bebayis sheyesh b'saycha shnei chadarim. Let's say you have a regular house. The house, of course, has a front door. Inside the house, there are 2 bedrooms. The Balabayas realizes that he has 2 extra bedrooms. So he rents out the 2 bedrooms to boarders. Okay, says the Mishnah Berurah, let's say the owner of the house rented out extra bedroom number 1 to Ruvain and extra bedroom number 2 to Shimon. And of course, in the rest of the house, that's where the balabayis, that's where the homeowner lives. But va'oivrim derech olav. How does Reuven get out the front door? He has to walk through the balabayis' house. How does Shimon get to the front door? He has to walk through the balabayis' house. So guess what? The homeowner of the house is a beis shar because he's got 2 people, Reuven and Shimon, who have their own independent rented living quarters walking through his house. So he's a beis shar. It comes out to Reuven and Shimon, the boarders who rented the house. They have to make independent contributions to the Ruva Chatzeres because they're diurin. But the homeowner doesn't have to make a contribution to the Ruva Chatzeres. Why? Because he's actually a beis shar to the 2 boarders. A little bit counterintuitive. Okay, let's move along. Sifches. 2 lines off the bottom says the Mechaber. Hamisareach b'chotzer. Somebody who's a guest in a chotzer. A transient resident of a chotzer. Afilu nisareach b'bayis b'fnei atzmai. Even if he's in a independent home in the chotzer. So again, you have your chotzer with 21 units. There's a guest home. There's a home that's available for rent. There's a home that's available for people who have to come for a Shabbos. Or maybe it's available for long stay people. It's an Airbnb. People can stay over there for 2 weeks. They can stay there for 3 weeks. But the people who live there are kind of guests in the chotzer. They're not permanent diurin in the chotzer. Hamisarech b'chotzer. Somebody who's a transient guest, so to speak, in the chotzer. Even if he's being a guest in a completely independent house. Says the Mechaber, if he's not there in a permanent fashion, what makes it temporary? He's there for 30 days or less. He's not going to aser. He's not considered a bona fide resident of the chotzer. And therefore, v'hu v'hem mutarim bein bebeisai, bein bebeisam. Everybody is mutter to transfer back and forth between the homes. They could transfer to and from their own homes. So again, if you have this chotzer that has 21 units in it, and unit number 21 is somebody who's temporary in the chotzer, he's not going to answer on anybody. So the 20 units of the permanent residents, they could transfer freely back and forth to each other. They could also transfer between their units and 21. 21 could transfer from his unit to the other units. Says the Mishmar's Cotton and Gimel, Amisarech b'chotzer. Afilu hayahadira b'schirus. This is true, even if the transient guest in the chotzer is actually renting out the home. So it kind of feels like a bona fide resident. He's renting. Ais Cotton and Daled, even if it's a bavayis b'fnei atzmai. He has his own fully independent home. Sha'oichel v'yoshed sham. He eats there. He sleeps there. The reason the Mechaber uses this interesting lashon b'fnei atzmai, the imahaya b'yachid in balabayis, If there's a balabayas in the home, and he's living together with the balabayas in the home, and he's eating at the balabayas' table, then I feel a bikfar and irev. Then even if he's there permanently, he wouldn't answer on the bnei achotzer, because he would be part of the balabayas' household. If this person is going to be there for more than 30 days, even if he's not renting, he's just borrowing this home, but he's there for more than 30 days, now he becomes a permanent resident. He's no longer considered a guest, and he's going to answer on the other bnei achotzer. You might wonder, what if this person's plans are to be in this home for 45 days? Does he already answer on day 12? Or he doesn't answer until day 30? No, if his plans are to be there for 45 days, he's already going to answer on day 1. Taz writes, to be Yosef Shloishim to Asrinan. This that we say, if he's there for more than 30 days, he answers on the other bnei achotzer. Dafka b'misarech b'makom she'ein kohol. That's only true if he's becoming a guest in a chotzer that's not a kehillah. What does the Mishnah Berurah mean? What does the Taz mean? Taz means like this. Remember a halacha that we learned earlier. You have a chotzer. On Erev Pesach, the Gabbai and the Rav get together and they make an eruv chatzeros. What are one of the things that they have to have in mind when they make an eruv chatzeros? We learned then that they have to have in mind that that the Rav, when he's makabel, when he accepts the pas of the Erev, he's being mezakeh in the pas of the Erev, not only on behalf of the present time residents of the Chotzer, he's also being mekabelit on behalf of anybody who's going to move into the Chotzer in the future. Now, in that case, if somebody comes in, let's say they made the Eruv Chatzeros on Erev Pesach, and then somebody comes to the Chotzer as a guest, Shavuos time, and he stays there for 45 days. He's not going to answer on the other bnei achotzer because he was included in the Eruv Chatzeros. That's why the Taz is pointing out this halakha is only germane if you don't have a kehillah set up where somebody made a proper Eruv Chatzeros on Erev Pesach. Then we don't have to worry about this guest who's there for 45 days. Because even without the Gabbai and the Rav speaking out that the Erev is going to be for anybody who moves into the Chotzer in the future, that's a halachic assumption. When we come in a Chotzer, where you know that there's a marketplace, where you always have these transient people. If you know that in your chotzer, it's very common that people will come and be guests in the chotzer for 30 days or more, then that's something that should be spoken out clearly, that the Erev is going to cover those people. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Einay Oyser, this guest who's going to be there for 30 days or less, doesn't answer on the other bnei achotzer. There are those that say that this is true, even if there's somebody who comes 5 times a year, or 10 times a year. 10 times a year he comes for 25 days. So if it's 10 times for 25 days, right? He's there for most of the year. But each time he's there for less than 30 days. So there are those that say that even in such a case, since Lamaisa, every time he comes, he's there for less than 30 days, he doesn't answer on the bnei achotzer. On the other hand, the yeshmi shemachmer bazeh, there are those that are more machmer, u'kamayl inyan akol b'sibichin peidal sefalef ayin sham. That's the halacha that we learned earlier. Okay, we're going to stop over here. We'll continue with the Ramah on Reish Lamed Zayin and base next time. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. It's close to limud HaTorah should be banging against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shalom should send Yeshua's for forest Parnasset Sheduchim Tulos in need. We should be zeicher to see the Bias Gold Tzedek B'Meher V'Yameinu Amen. Be well.